The glint of gold caught my eye as I reached for the crumpled receipt in Jack's jacket pocket. My heart raced as I smoothed out the paper, revealing a jaw-dropping sum for a piece of jewelry I'd never seen. Confusion turned to dread as I realized this wasn't a surprise gift for me. "Jack?" I called out, my voice wavering. "Can you come here for a minute?" My husband of 10 years sauntered into our bedroom, his easy smile fading as he saw the receipt in my trembling hand. "Laura, what are you doing going through my things?" I held up the damning evidence. "What's this? Because I know it's not for me." Jack's face hardened, and in that moment, I knew. The air left my lungs as if I'd been punched. He didn't even try to lie. "It's for Molly," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I'm sorry you found out this way, but maybe it's for the best." "Molly?" I repeated, the name tasting bitter on my tongue. "Who the hell is Molly?" Jack sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "She's someone I've been seeing. For a while now." The world tilted on its axis. I gripped the edge of the dresser to steady myself. "How long is a while, Jack?" 6 months, he admitted, not meeting my eyes. 6 months. Half a year of lies, of betrayal. I thought of all the late nights at the office, the sudden business trips. How could I have been so blind? Why? I choked out, tears threatening to spill over. Jack's gaze snapped to mine, a flash of anger in his eyes. "You really want to know why, Laura? Because Molly can give me what you can't." The words hit me like a slap. We'd been trying for a baby for years, with no success. Each negative test had been a knife to my heart, but I'd always believed we were in it together. How wrong I'd been. "That's not fair," I whispered, my voice breaking. "We've been through this together. We talked about adoption, about—" "It's not the same," Jack interrupted, his composure cracking. "I want my own child, Laura. A legacy, and Molly. She understands that." I felt sick. "So what? You're just going to throw away 10 years of marriage for some younger model who might be able to pop out a kid?" Jack's silence was answer enough. I sank onto the bed, my legs no longer able to support me. "Does your mother know?" A flicker of guilt crossed his face. "Helen, she's met Molly. She likes her." Of course she did. My mother-in-law had never approved of me, always hinting that Jack could do better. I guess she'd finally gotten her wish. "Get out," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Laura, get out!" I stood, finding strength in my anger. "I can't even look at you right now. Just go." Jack hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He grabbed his keys and wallet from the nightstand. At the doorway, he paused. "I am sorry, Laura. I never meant to hurt you." I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Well, you did a piss-poor job of that, didn't you?" The front door slammed, and I was alone. The silence of the house pressed in on me, suffocating. I looked around the room we'd shared for so long, seeing it with new eyes. How many lies had been told here? How many nights had he lain beside me thinking of her? My gaze fell on our wedding photo on the dresser. With a cry of rage, I swept it to the floor, glass shattering. As I stared at the broken frame, a realization hit me. My life, the future I'd planned, lay in pieces at my feet, but as the initial shock began to fade, another emotion took its place. Determination. I might be down, but I was far from out. Jack and his precious Molly had no idea what was coming. I reached for my phone, fingers shaking as I dialed a number. "Dad? It's me. I need your help." I stared at the business card in my hand, my stomach churning. Discreet Investigations was embossed in gold lettering, a stark contrast to the turmoil in my heart. My father's words echoed in my head. "Laura, honey, you need to know the whole truth." With trembling fingers, I dialed the number. A gruff voice answered. "Malone speaking." "Mr. Malone, this is Laura Jennings. I need your help." We arranged to meet at a cafe the next day. As I hung up, a wave of nausea hit me. Was I really going to spy on my own husband? The cafe was bustling when I arrived, but I spotted Malone immediately. He looked exactly like a private investigator should. Weathered face, sharp eyes, and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Mrs. Jennings," he nodded as I sat down. "Tell me what you need." I took a deep breath. "I need evidence of my husband's affair. Concrete proof." Malone's expression didn't change. "Consider it done. I'll need some information." For the next hour, I laid bare the intimate details of my life. Jack's schedule, his habits, even the make and model of his car. With each revelation, I felt a piece of my heart crumble. "I'll be in touch within a week," Malone said as we parted. "Try to act normal in the meantime." Normal. What a joke. but I managed to go through the motions, even as Jack's lies became more apparent. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, how had I been so blind? 5 agonizing days later, my phone buzzed with a text from Malone. Evidence collected. Meeting tomorrow? Same place. That night, as Jack mumbled another excuse about working late, I felt a surge of anger. "Don't bother coming home," I snapped. "I'm sure Molly would love to have you." Jack froze, his face paling. "Laura, I held up a hand. "Save it. I know everything." The next morning, I met Malone with a mix of dread and determination. He slid a manila envelope across the table. "It's all there," he said gruffly. "Photos, video, even some audio recordings. You sure you want to see this?" I nodded, my throat tight. With shaking hands, I opened the envelope and began to sift through its contents. The first photo hit me like a punch to the gut. Jack and a younger woman, Molly, I presumed, locked in an embrace outside a restaurant. Their intimacy was undeniable. More photos followed, stolen kisses in a park, holding hands as they entered a jewelry store. My eyes blurred with tears as I recognized the necklace Molly wore, the one from the receipt that had started this whole nightmare. But it was the audio recording that truly broke me. Jack's voice, low and intimate, filled my ears. "I love you, Molly. I've never felt this way before. Laura, she just doesn't understand me like you do." A sob escaped me, drawing concerned looks from nearby patrons. Malone discreetly pushed a box of tissues towards me. "There's more," he said quietly, "but I think you've seen enough." I nodded, unable to speak. As I gathered the damning evidence, a strange calm settled over me. The pain was still there, raw and bleeding, but alongside it was a steely resolve. "Thank you, Mr. Malone," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You've given me exactly what I needed." As I left the cafe, clutching the envelope to my chest, I knew my next move. It was time to confront Jack, to force him to face the consequences of his actions. No more lies, no more excuses. My phone buzzed. A text from Jack. "We need to talk. I'm coming home early." Perfect timing. I typed a quick reply. "Yes, we do. I'll be waiting." The stage was set for a showdown. As I drove home, my mind raced with all the things I wanted to say, all the pain I wanted to inflict. But one thought rose above the rest. Whatever happened next, I would face it on my terms. Jack had underestimated me, but he was about to learn just how strong I could be. The front door clicked open, and I steeled myself for the confrontation. Jack walked in, his face a mask of practiced contrition. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. "Laura, we need to talk," he began, but I cut him off. "You're right, we do." I slapped the manila envelope on the coffee table. "Why don't you start by explaining these?" Jack's eyes widened as he leafed through the photos. His face cycled through shock, anger, and finally settled on a cold resignation. "So, you hired a private investigator." "I had to know the truth," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "though I guess I should thank you for making it so easy to catch you." He sank into the armchair, running a hand through his hair. "Laura, I never meant for it to go this far. Molly, she—" "Save it," I snapped. "I don't want to hear about your precious Molly. What I want to know is why. Why throw away 10 years of marriage?" Jack's eyes met mine, and I was shocked by the anger I saw there. "You really want to know why? Because I want a family, Laura, a real family with children, and you can't give me that." His words hit me like a physical blow. "We talked about adoption, about other options." "It's not the same," Jack shouted, standing up. "I want my own flesh and blood, a legacy. Molly understands that. She wants the same things I do." I felt my own anger rising to match his. "So that's it? I'm just a defective baby-making machine to you?" "That's not fair," Jack said, but his eyes betrayed him. "You know what's not fair?" I spat. "Throwing away a decade of love and commitment because your wife can't get pregnant. That's not fair, Jack." He had the decency to look ashamed, but only for a moment. "I'm sorry, Laura, but I've made my decision. I want a divorce." The word hung in the air between us, heavy and final. I'd known it was coming, but hearing it still felt like a knife to the heart. "Fine," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "If that's what you want." Jack nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. These are the initial divorce papers. I think you'll find the terms fair." I stared at the envelope, not reaching for it. "How long have you been planning this?" He hesitated. "A few months. I wanted to make sure everything was in order before you ripped my life apart." I finished for him. Jack sighed. "Laura, please. This doesn't have to be ugly. My mother, Helen, she's offered to mediate. Helen, I laughed bitterly. Let me guess, she's thrilled about all this. His silence was answer enough. Of course Helen would be overjoyed. She'd never approved of me, always hinting that Jack could do better. Now she had the daughter-in-law she'd always wanted. She likes Molly, Jack said quietly. They've become quite close. Something inside me snapped. I grabbed the nearest object, a framed photo of our wedding day, and hurled it at the wall. It shattered spectacularly, glass raining down on the carpet. Get out, I hissed. Get out of my house and take your damn papers with you. Jack looked startled by my outburst. Laura, be reasonable. Reasonable? I advanced on him, fury giving me strength. You want reasonable? How's this for reasonable? I'll see you in court, Jack, and I promise you I will fight you for every last penny. He backed away, hands raised in surrender. You don't want to do this, Laura. Think about... I said get out. I screamed, my voice raw with pain and rage. Jack hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He placed the divorce papers on the table and walked to the door. With his hand on the knob, he turned back. I am sorry, Laura. For what it's worth, I did love you. As the door closed behind him, I collapsed to the floor, sobs racking my body. The life I'd known was over, shattered like the wedding photo on the floor. But as I cried, a small, determined voice in the back of my mind whispered, This isn't the end. It's just the beginning of my fight. The sound of a car door slamming jolted me awake. I blinked, disoriented, realizing I'd fallen asleep on the couch. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the mess from last night's confrontation. The shattered wedding photo lay accusingly on the floor. I stumbled to the window, my heart sinking as I watched Jack loading boxes into his car. This was really happening. He was leaving? Before I could think better of it, I yanked open the front door. So that's it? You're just going to sneak away while I'm sleeping? Jack froze, a box in his arms. I didn't want to make this any harder than it needs to be, Laura. Oh, how considerate of you, I spat, the words dripping with sarcasm. He sighed, setting the box down. Look, I've left the divorce papers on the kitchen table. My lawyer will be in touch about... Your lawyer, I interrupted. What happened to Helen mediating? A flicker of guilt crossed Jack's face. Mom thought it would be better to keep things professional. I laughed bitterly. Of course she did. Wouldn't want to risk me poisoning her precious son against her new favorite daughter-in-law. Laura, please, Jack said, his voice strained. Can we not do this? Do what, Jack? Acknowledge the fact that you're abandoning our marriage for a younger model who can give you the babies I couldn't? His face hardened. That's not fair. You know it's more complicated than that. Is it? I challenged. Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty simple. You found someone who could give you what you wanted, so you're throwing away 10 years like they meant nothing. Jack ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. I never meant to hurt you, Laura, but we want different things. It's better this way. Better for who? I demanded, tears stinging my eyes. For you? For Molly? For your mother? Because it sure as hell isn't better for me. He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. I'm sorry. I truly am, but this is how it has to be. As Jack turned back to his car, something inside me snapped. I stormed back into the house, grabbing the first thing I could find, a vase he'd given me for our 5th anniversary. Without thinking, I hurled it at his retreating back. It missed, shattering on the driveway instead. Jack whirled around, shock written across his face. Jesus, Laura! What the hell? Get out! I screamed, my voice raw with pain and fury. Get out, and don't you dare come back! Neighbors were starting to peek out their windows, drawn by the commotion. I didn't care. Let them see. Let them all see what Jack had reduced me to. He raised his hands in surrender, backing towards his car. I'm going. Just take care of yourself, Laura. I watched, trembling with rage and grief, as Jack got into his car and drove away. The finality of it hit me like a physical blow. He was gone. Really, truly gone. Stumbling back inside, I collapsed onto the couch, sobs racking my body. How had my life fallen apart so completely? Just days ago, I thought I had it all, a loving husband, a successful career, a beautiful home. Now, it was all ashes. As the tears subsided, leaving me feeling hollow and drained, my gaze fell on the divorce papers on the kitchen table. They seemed to mock me, a stark reminder of my new reality. With shaking hands, I reached for them. I had to face this head on. No more crying, no more throwing things. It was time to be strong, to fight for myself. I picked up my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I needed. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Dad?" I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need your help. Do you know any good divorce lawyers?" As I listened to my father's concerned response, a steely resolve settled over me. Jack thought he could just walk away, that I'd roll over and accept whatever scraps he deigned to throw my way. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of my fight. The waiting room of Dr. Patel's office felt suffocating. I'd been here countless times before, each visit a reminder of my failure to conceive. Now, 2 weeks after Jack's departure, I sat here again, but for an entirely different reason. "Laura Jennings?" the nurse called, her voice jarring me from my thoughts. I followed her to the examination room, my stomach churning with more than just nausea. Dr. Patel entered moments later, her kind face creased with concern. "Laura, how are you feeling?" she asked, glancing at my chart. "Terrible," I admitted. "I've been sick for days. I thought it was stress from everything, but it's not getting better." Dr. Patel nodded sympathetically. "I see. Well, let's run some tests and see what's going on." As she drew blood and ordered other tests, my mind raced. Could it be? No, it was impossible. After years of trying, of heartbreak and disappointment, there was no way. An hour later, Dr. Patel returned, her expression unreadable. "Laura, I have your results." I braced myself, expecting the worst. "What is it? Is something wrong?" She took a deep breath. "Laura, you're pregnant." The world tilted on its axis. What? Pregnant?" Dr. Patel repeated, a smile breaking across her face. "About 6 weeks along." 6 weeks. My mind reeled, doing the math. It must have happened right before Jack left, during one of our last attempts to salvage our marriage. But how? I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "We tried for so long." Dr. Patel squeezed my hand. "Sometimes, Laura, these things happen when we least expect them. Your body was under less stress, perhaps." Her voice faded into background noise as the reality sank in. I was pregnant, with Jack's child, the child he'd left me for not being able to provide. "Laura?" Dr. Patel's voice cut through my thoughts. "Are you all right?" I nodded, unable to speak. She continued, outlining next steps, scheduling follow-up appointments, but my mind was elsewhere, grappling with the enormity of this revelation. As I left the clinic, my phone buzzed. A text from Jack. "Lawyer wants to meet next week to finalize divorce terms. Let me know if that works for you." A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat. Oh, how the tables had turned. I typed back a quick "fine" before calling the one person I knew I could trust. "Mom," I said when she answered, "I need you and Dad to come over. Now." An hour later, I sat across from my parents in my living room, clutching a mug of tea like a lifeline. "Sweetheart," my mother said gently, "what's going on? You're scaring us." I took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was deafening. Then my father's voice, gruff with emotion. "Does Jack know?" I shook my head. "No one knows except you two. I just found out today." "Oh, Laura," my mother breathed, moving to sit beside me. "What are you going to do?" That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? What was I going to do? Tell Jack and risk him coming back out of obligation? Keep it a secret and raise this child alone? The possibilities swirled in my mind, each more daunting than the last. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice breaking. I don't know." My father leaned forward, his eyes fierce with protective love. "Whatever you decide, we're here for you, all the way." As my parents enveloped me in a hug, I felt a surge of strength. This child, this miracle I'd longed for, was now my responsibility, my chance at the family I'd always wanted. In that moment, I made my decision. I would keep this baby, with or without Jack. I would fight for my child, for our future, with everything I had. "I'm keeping the baby," I said, my voice steady for the first time in weeks, "and I'm going to need a better lawyer." My parents exchanged a look of determination. "We'll call Cousin Sarah." My father said, "She's the best family lawyer in the state." As they started making plans, I placed a hand on my still flat stomach. To this tiny life inside me, I made a silent promise. I will protect you, love you, and give you the best life possible, no matter what. The road ahead would be hard, but I was ready. This was the dawn of my new life, and I intended to face it head on. The conference room felt like a battlefield. On one side sat Jack and his lawyer, their faces impassive. On the other, I sat with Sarah, my cousin and now fierce legal advocate. My hand rested protectively over my slightly swollen belly, hidden beneath a loose blouse. "Let's begin," Sarah said, her voice crisp. "We're here to finalize the divorce terms." Jack's lawyer nodded, sliding a document across the table. "We believe these terms are more than fair, considering the circumstances." I scanned the paper, my blood boiling. Jack was offering a pittance in alimony, claiming most of our shared assets, and even trying to keep the house we'd bought together. "This is ridiculous," I spat. "You're trying to leave me with nothing." Jack finally met my eyes. "Laura, be reasonable. You know I was the primary breadwinner." "Reasonable?" I laughed bitterly. "Like you were reasonable when you threw away our marriage for a younger woman?" His lawyer intervened. "Let's keep emotions out of this. The facts are clear." "The facts?" I interrupted. "Here's a fact for you. I'm pregnant." The room fell silent, Jack's face drained of color. "What? That's impossible. We tried for years." "Well, it happened," I said, my voice steady. "Right before you left, so your fair terms, they need some serious adjustment." Jack's lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently. I could see the panic in Jack's eyes. "This changed everything. We'll need to reassess," his lawyer said finally, "in light of this development." Sarah nodded, a predatory gleam in her eye. "We thought you might. Now let's talk about real fairness." The next hour was a blur of negotiations, child support, custody arrangements, division of assets. Everything was on the table. Jack seemed shell-shocked, barely participating, as his lawyer fought for every inch. Finally, we reached an agreement. I would keep the house, receive substantial alimony and child support, and have primary custody. Jack would have visitation rights, but limited ones. As we prepared to sign, Jack spoke up. "Wait, I want to be part of this child's life. I want joint custody." I felt a surge of rage. "Now you want to be a father, after leaving me because I couldn't give you children?" "That was different," he protested. "I didn't know." "Exactly," I cut him off. "You didn't know, and you didn't care. You walked away. You don't get to waltz back in now that it's convenient." Jack's face hardened. "I have rights. This is my child, too." "Your rights," I laughed humorlessly. "What about my rights when you were sleeping with Molly? When you let your mother treat me like dirt?" With a mention of Helen seemed to deflate Jack. "Laura, please, we can work this out." I shook my head. "No, Jack, we can't. You made your choice. Now you have to live with it." I turned to Sarah. "Add a clause. Neither Jack nor Helen can contact the child without my express permission." Jack's lawyer started to protest, but Sarah was already drafting the addition. "It's within her rights," she said firmly, "given the circumstances of the separation." As Jack signed the papers, his hand shaking slightly, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It was done. I was free. Outside the office, Jack caught up to me. "Laura, wait. Can't we talk about this?" I turned to face him, one hand on my belly. "There's nothing left to say, Jack? You wanted a family? Well, congratulations, you're going to be a father, but you lost the right to be a husband and partner when you walked out that door." His face crumpled. "I made a mistake. I see that now. Please give me another chance." For a moment, I wavered. Then I remembered the pain, the betrayal, the night spent crying myself to sleep. "No," I said firmly. "This is my chance now. My chance at the family I always wanted, without you." As I walked away, leaving Jack standing alone on the sidewalk, I felt a mix of triumph and sadness. This wasn't how I'd imagined starting a family, but it was my reality now, and I was determined to make the best of it. I placed a protective hand on my stomach. "It's just you and me now, little one," I whispered, "and we're going to be just fine." The shrill cry of my son Ethan pierced through the peaceful Saturday morning. I rushed to his room, my heart racing. As I scooped him into my arms, a commotion outside caught my attention. Through the window, I saw a familiar car pulling into my driveway. My blood ran cold. Helen. "Shh, it's okay, baby," I murmured to Ethan, even as panic rose in my throat. What was she doing here? The doorbell rang, followed by insistent knocking. "Laura, I know you're in there. Open up." I clutched Ethan tighter, my mind racing. 2 years of peace, of building a life for just the two of us. And now this. "Laura," Helen's voice grew more shrill. "I have a right to see my grandson." "No, you don't," I whispered, but my voice shook. The divorce agreement was clear. Neither Jack nor Helen could contact us without my permission. The knocking turned to pounding. "If you don't open this door, I'm calling the police," A hysterical laugh bubbled up inside me. Go ahead, I called out, finding my voice. I'm sure they'd love to hear how you're violating a court order. There was a moment of silence, then Helen's voice, dripping with venom. You can't keep him from us forever, Laura. He's Jack's son, too. I felt a surge of protective rage. He stopped being Jack's son the moment he walked out on us. You bitch! Helen screamed. I heard a crash. She must have thrown something at the door. Ethan began to wail again, frightened by the noise. I bounced him gently, trying to calm him even as my own heart raced. It's okay, sweetie, I soothed. Grandma's just leaving. But Helen wasn't leaving. I could hear her on the phone, her voice rising in pitch. Yes, officer. I'm trying to see my grandson, and his mother is refusing to let me in. It's 1852 Maple Street. Please hurry. My hands shook as I reached for my own phone. I dialed Sarah's number, praying she'd pick up on a Saturday. Laura? Sarah answered, sounding concerned. What's wrong? Helen's here, I said, my voice trembling. She's demanding to see Ethan. She's called the police. Stay calm, Sarah said, her lawyer voice kicking in. Don't open the door. I'm on my way. If the police arrive before me, show them the court order. It's in the blue folder in your study, remember? I nodded, then realized she couldn't see me. Okay, thank you, Sarah. As I hung up, I heard sirens in the distance. This was really happening. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the confrontation to come. I carried Ethan downstairs, retrieving the blue folder from my study. Through the window, I could see a police car pulling up. Helen was gesticulating wildly, pointing at the house. The officer approached my door, knocking firmly. Ma'am? This is Officer Rodriguez. Can you please open the door? With shaking hands, I unlocked the door, Ethan on my hip and the folder clutched to my chest. Officer, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, I have a court order here prohibiting this woman from contacting me or my son without my express permission. I handed him the document. As he read it, Helen pushed forward, her face contorted with rage. That's my grandson, she shrieked. You can't keep him from me. The officer held up a hand, silencing her. Ma'am, this order is clear. You're in violation by being here. Helen's face crumpled. But he's family. Laura, please, just let me see him. For a moment, I wavered. Then I remembered the pain, the betrayal, the nights spent crying while pregnant and alone. No, I said firmly. You lost that right when you supported Jack abandoning us. Officer, I want to press charges for harassment. Helen's wail of anguish was cut off by Sarah's arrival. As my cousin-turned-lawyer took charge of the situation, I retreated inside with Ethan, my legs finally giving out as I sank onto the couch. I hugged my son close, tears streaming down my face. We'd weathered this storm, but at what cost? And how many more battles lay ahead? As I heard Helen being led away, still protesting, I made a silent vow. No matter what it took, I would protect Ethan. From Helen, from Jack, from anyone who threatened our peace. We'd come too far to let anyone tear us apart now. The cafe bustled with the morning rush, but I barely noticed as I stared at the text message on my phone. It was from Sarah, my lawyer and cousin. Jack's filing for increased visitation. Hearing set for next month. Call me ASAP. My hands shook as I set the phone down. After 3 years of relative peace, Jack was making a move. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. Mommy, can I have more juice? Ethan's voice cut through my panic. I looked at my son, his face smeared with syrup from his pancakes, and felt a surge of protective love. Of course, sweetie, I said, forcing a smile. As I poured his juice, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a number I didn't recognize. Hello? I answered cautiously. Laura? A woman's voice, hesitant and familiar. It's Molly. I nearly dropped the phone. Molly? What do you want? There was a pause, then a shaky breath. I thought you should know. Jack and I were getting divorced. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. What? Why? We've been trying to have a baby, Molly said, her voice thick with tears. But I can't. I can't conceive. Jack couldn't handle it. He left last week. A hysterical laugh bubbled up inside me. The irony was almost too much to bear. Laura? Molly's voice was small. I'm so sorry. For everything. I never should have. Save it, I cut her off. You made your choices. Now you have to live with them. Just like I did. I hung up, my mind reeling. Jack leaving Molly for the same reason he'd left me. It felt like cosmic justice, but it brought me no joy. As I looked at Ethan, happily munching on his breakfast, a realization hit me. This was my chance. With Jack's life in shambles, I could push for full custody. No more visitation battles, no more fear of Helen's interference. I dialed Sarah's number. I just heard from Molly. Jack left her. I want to file for full custody. Sarah's sharp intake of breath was audible. Laura, are you sure? This could get ugly. I'm sure, I said, my voice steady. It's time to end this, once and for all. The next month was a whirlwind of legal preparations and sleepless nights. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. As I walked into the courtroom, I saw Jack for the first time in years. He looked haggard, defeated. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. Then I remembered everything he'd put me through, and my resolve hardened. The judge looked between us, her expression stern. Mr. Jennings, you're seeking increased visitation. Mrs. Jennings, you're countering with a request for full custody. Let's hear your arguments. Jack's lawyer went first, painting a picture of a reformed man who'd made mistakes but deserved a second chance. When it was our turn, Sarah laid out our case methodically. Jack's abandonment, his pattern of leaving when things got tough, the stability I'd provided for Ethan. As the judge deliberated, Jack approached me. Laura, please, he whispered. Don't take my son away from me. I've lost everything else. I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in years. I saw the man I'd once loved, the father of my child. But I also saw the man who'd broken my heart, who'd walked away when things got hard. You lost him the day you walked out on us, I said, my voice low but firm. I'm just making it official. The judge's decision was swift and final. Full custody granted to me, with Jack allowed supervised visitation twice a month. As she read out the terms, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It was over. We were free. Outside the courtroom, I hugged Sarah tightly. Thank you, I whispered, for everything. She squeezed me back. You did this, Laura. You fought for yourself and for Ethan. I'm so proud of you. As I drove home, my mind raced with possibilities. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. No more looking over my shoulder, no more fear of Jack or Helen swooping in to disrupt our lives. I picked up Ethan from my parents' house, hugging him close. How about we go for ice cream, buddy? I suggested. His face lit up. Really? Can I have 2 scoops? I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in years. You can have as many scoops as you want. We're celebrating. As we sat in the ice cream parlor, Ethan happily devouring his sundae, I looked at my son and felt a surge of love and pride. We'd been through so much, but we'd come out stronger. This was our new beginning, our chance at the family I'd always dreamed of. It wasn't the path I'd expected, but sitting here with my son, I knew without a doubt this was exactly where I was meant to be.
Ex-son-in-law threatened to cut us off from our grandkids unless we spoil his 6 kids too. You never think you're going to be the one to lose a kid. Like, you know what happens to people. You hear about it on the news, or maybe you know someone who knows someone, but when it happens to you, man, it just hits you in a way nothing else does. Brianna, my youngest, was the light of our lives. She was one of those people who could light up a room just by walking into it. You'd hear her laugh before you even saw her. And as a mom, you just don't imagine anything could take that away. You always think you'll go first, that you'll be there for them when they're old and wrinkly. But life doesn't care about your plans, does it? Brianna got sick when Zach and Mia were still pretty young, like 8 and 9. And I don't mean just a little sick. I mean the kind of sick where you spend every other day in the hospital, where you can't remember what normal feels like anymore. It wasn't long before it was clear that this wasn't something she was going to walk away from. Her husband, Kevin, checked out early. I mean, physically he was there, but it was like he couldn't deal. He stopped showing up for her in the ways that mattered. I'm not here to bash him. Okay, maybe I am. But like, when your wife is going through the hardest thing she'll ever go through, that's when you step up, right? Kevin didn't. He just kind of let everything fall on us. Me and my husband were the ones taking her to her treatments, watching the kids, trying to keep everything from falling apart. I'll never forget one of the last conversations I had with Brianna. She was so tired, Not just from the illness, but from worrying about what would happen to her kids when she wasn't there anymore. She told me she was scared Kevin would replace her, that he'd bring some new woman in and the kids would forget her. And man, when your kid looks at you like that, so scared and so helpless, you make promises you never thought you'd have to make. I told her we'd always be there for Zach and Mia, that we'd make sure they'd always remember their mom and know how much she loved them. She made me swear we'd look out for them no matter what, and I did. I meant it too. When she finally passed, I don't know how to explain it. It's like there's this huge hole in your chest where your heart used to be, and nothing can fill it. But we had to stay strong for Zach and Mia. They were devastated, and we were all they had left of their mom. I remember how Zach wouldn't let go of Brianna's hand, even after she was gone, like he thought if he just held on tight enough, she wouldn't leave. Mia barely said anything for weeks. The way they grieved, it broke my heart all over again. We tried to hold everything together, but Kevin? 8 months. 8 months after Brianna passed, this man moved some woman, Cindy, into their house. I still remember the first time Zach and Mia told me about her. It was like they were scared to say her name, like just talking about her was betraying their mom. I won't lie, I hated her before I even met her. Not because of who she was, but because of what she represented. It was too soon. Brianna hadn't even been gone a year, and he was already playing house with someone else. It felt like a slap in the face. Cindy, by the way, came with her own set of baggage. She had a kid from some other guy, and if that wasn't enough, she was pregnant with Kevin's kid too. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. But the worst part wasn't Cindy herself. It was the fact that Kevin acted like this was normal. Like we were all just supposed to pretend that this was some natural progression. He even had the audacity to suggest that we treat Cindy's kid like our own grandkid. Now, I love kids. I've raised 3 of them, and I'd go to the ends of the earth for my grandchildren. But let me be clear, Cindy's kid was not my grandchild. I wasn't about to sit there and pretend otherwise. But Kevin, in his infinite wisdom, decided to lay down some rules. He said that if we wanted to stay in Zach and Mia's lives, we had to accept Cindy's kid as part of the package deal. Like, are you serious? We had to treat her kid like one of our own or else risk losing our relationship with Zach and Mia? He tried to dress it up like it was all about giving the kids a chance to form new family bonds without us interfering. But I saw right through that crap. It was him trying to wipe away Brianna's memory. He wanted to replace her with this new woman and her kids, and that wasn't happening on my watch. No way. At that point, we were backed into a corner. We loved Zach and Mia more than anything, and the idea of losing them was unbearable. So, we talked to a lawyer. Turns out we could get grandparents' visitation rights, and we went for it. Yeah, it was a messy, painful process, but in the end we got what we wanted, time with Zach and Mia. It wasn't a lot at first, just weekends here and there, but it was enough to keep that connection strong. And let me tell you, Zach and Mia made it clear from day one that they had no interest in their dad's new family. They came to our house, and it was like a weight lifted off their shoulders. They didn't have to play nice with Cindy or pretend like everything was okay. They could just be themselves. They could talk about their mom, laugh about old memories, and not feel guilty about it. Kevin never liked it, though. I could see it every time he dropped them off or picked them up. He knew they weren't bonding with Cindy's kid or the new baby, and he hated that. But that wasn't my problem. My only concern was Zach and Mia. They were my family, and I wasn't going to let anyone take them away from me. Things were already pretty tense after Kevin brought Cindy into the picture, but what really kicked it up a notch was when he started pushing this package deal nonsense. At first I thought maybe he was just trying to find a way to blend their families, but it wasn't like that. It felt more like he wanted to erase the past and start over, and that meant wiping out anything that connected Zach and Mia to their mom, Brianna. It was like he wanted us to pretend Brianna never existed, like her death gave him a clean slate to do whatever he wanted with no consequences. One day, Kevin calls me up and says he wants to have a family meeting. I didn't like the sound of that. Family meetings with Kevin usually meant he was going to try and guilt trip us or pull some new stunt, but I didn't want to refuse. I was still trying to keep things civil enough for the sake of Zach and Mia. So my husband and I show up at their place, and Cindy's there, sitting at the table with her kid on her lap, looking like she's got something real important to say. I knew right then this was going to be bad. Kevin starts off all polite, talking about how things have been hard on the kids since Brianna passed, and how much he appreciates us being in their lives. I'm sitting there thinking, okay, what's the catch? And then he drops it. He says, Cindy and I want to make sure all the kids grow up as one big happy family, and for that to happen, we need your support. I just sat there waiting for him to get to the point. He goes on to say, we want you to start treating Cindy's daughter like she's your grandchild. We're a package deal now, and if you can't accept that, it's going to make things really difficult for Zach and Mia. I could feel my blood pressure rising. I mean, what? I wasn't even sure how to respond at first. This guy, was telling us that if we wanted to see our own grandkids, we had to treat Cindy's kid, who's got nothing to do with us, like she was ours too? Like, I'm sorry, but that's not how this works. My husband, always the more level-headed one, tried to stay calm. He said, we're here for Zach and Mia, and we always will be. But we can't just pretend someone else's child is our grandkid. It doesn't work that way. Kevin didn't like that answer at all. His whole demeanor changed in a second. He went from Mr. Polite to straight up angry. He slammed his hand on the table and said, If you can't accept this family, then maybe you shouldn't be part of it at all. I was fuming at this point. I said, "Excuse me? We've been here for Zach and Mia since day one. We were there when you weren't. And now you want to tell us we're not part of their lives unless we play along with this fantasy of yours?" Cindy, who had been sitting there quietly this whole time, finally chimed in. She said, "We just want what's best for the kids. They need stability, and part of that is accepting this new family dynamic. We're not trying to replace Brianna, but we need to move forward." The audacity of her saying that, like she hadn't just waltzed into the picture barely a year after Brianna was gone, drove me crazy. I wanted to yell, to scream, but I knew that wouldn't help Zach and Mia. So I took a deep breath and said, "We're here for our grandkids, and nothing's going to change that. But we're not here to play make-believe with someone else's child." Kevin just stared at me, like he couldn't believe I was standing my ground. Then he said something I'll never forget. He said, "If you can't accept all of us, you'll lose all of us." It felt like a punch in the gut. I mean, this guy was actually threatening to take away our grandkids unless we played by his rules. I looked over at my husband, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. We couldn't let that happen. But at the same time, I wasn't going to let Kevin manipulate us into pretending something that wasn't real. Cindy's kid wasn't our grandchild, and I wasn't going to pretend she was just to keep Kevin happy. The rest of the meeting was basically a standoff. Kevin wasn't backing down, and neither were we. It was clear we weren't going to come to any kind of agreement that day, so we left, not really knowing what was going to happen next. The drive home was quiet. My husband and I didn't say much, but I could tell we were both worried about the same thing. What if Kevin really did cut us off from Zach and Mia? What if he followed through on his threat? A few days later, we got a call from Kevin. He told us that unless we agreed to his terms, we wouldn't be allowed to see the kids anymore. It was exactly what we feared. My heart sank, but I wasn't about to let him bully us into submission. That's when we decided to talk to a lawyer. It wasn't an easy decision, but we knew we had to fight for Zach and Mia. We weren't going to let Kevin take them away from us just because we refused to play along with his package deal fantasy. Our lawyer told us we had a good case for grandparents' visitation rights, given how close we were to Zach and Mia and how much we had been involved in their lives. It wasn't going to be easy, but we had a chance. When we told Kevin we were taking legal action, he flipped. He accused us of trying to destroy his new family, of not caring about what was best for the kids. But I knew that wasn't true. We cared more about Zach and Mia than anything, and that's why we were willing to fight for them. The court process was stressful and dragged out, but in the end, we got what we wanted. Visitation rights with Zach and Mia. It wasn't as much time as we had before, but it was enough. And the best part was that Zach and Mia made it clear they still wanted to be part of our lives. They didn't care about their dad's threats or his new family. They cared about us, and that was all that mattered. Update 1. By the time we had our visitation rights sorted, things started changing in Kevin's world, and not for the better. I wasn't surprised, though. I always had a gut feeling that his choices were going to catch up to him sooner or later. You can't just blow up your family and pretend like everything's fine. For starters, Kevin's relationship with his own family went down the drain. His parents, siblings, they all distanced themselves after what he pulled. They were always close with Brianna, and it didn't sit right with them how fast he moved on. One day he's burying his wife, and the next he's playing house with Cindy and her kid. I guess his parents couldn't get on board with that, and they started fading out of his life. He wasn't talking to them much, and when he did, it was just arguments about the way he was handling things. Honestly, that's when I realized just how much of a mess Kevin's life had become. I mean, it's one thing to lose your wife, but to then alienate your entire family in the process? That's on you. I can't say I felt bad for him. I was still angry at him for trying to control how we were supposed to act around Zach and Mia, but at the same time, I knew this wasn't just affecting him. It was dragging Zach and Mia down too. Then there was Cindy's side of the family, and trust me, they were just as distant. I don't know all the details, but from what I gathered, Cindy's family wasn't exactly thrilled about her bringing Kevin into the picture. They weren't close to begin with, and now that she had moved in with a guy who had his own baggage, it seemed like they'd washed their hands of her. So now Kevin was stuck in this house with 6 kids, and no one was willing to help him out. It was just him and Cindy, and honestly, they were both drowning. Zach and Mia told me little things here and there about how things were going at home. They never outright complained, but you could tell things weren't great. Zach mentioned that Cindy's first kid, from her previous relationship, was acting out a lot. I guess the poor kid was confused, didn't know where she fit in this mess of a blended family. I mean, she had her mom, but her dad was out of the picture, and now she was living with Kevin, who probably didn't treat her much differently than we did. Not like his own. That kind of stuff messes with a kid's head. And then there were the two new kids, Kevin's and Cindy's, both under 5 years old, running around the house while Zach and Mia were trying to keep their heads down and survive. You could tell they weren't really part of that new family. They were Brianna's kids, not Cindy's. And no matter how hard Kevin tried to push that package deal, it was clear the lines were drawn. At first, I thought maybe Zach and Mia would start pulling away from us because of all this. Like maybe they'd feel bad for not bonding with their half-siblings, or start falling in line with their dad's new family. But nope. If anything, they wanted to spend more time with us. They were both teenagers by then, and teenagers have a pretty good sense of who they want to be around. And it wasn't Kevin or Cindy. They were always calling, asking if they could come over for the weekend or stay during breaks. And of course, we always said yes. We made sure Zach and Mia had everything they needed when they were with us. We didn't want them feeling like they were missing out on anything just because their home life was falling apart. I'll admit we spoiled them more than maybe some grandparents would, but I felt like we had to. They deserved it after everything they'd been through. Kevin, though, he wasn't happy about that. He made it clear he thought we were giving them too much, making things too easy for them. He said they needed to learn responsibility and that we were undermining his parenting. I almost laughed when he said that, because what parenting was he even talking about? From what I could see, he wasn't doing much of it. One time, Zach came over to our place and showed me some new shoes he'd gotten from Kevin. They were cheap, falling apart after just a few weeks. Zach wasn't complaining, but I could tell he was embarrassed. That's when I took him out and got him a proper pair of shoes, the kind that would actually last. Kevin found out about it later and threw a fit. He said we were making him look bad in front of his own son. But the thing is, I wasn't trying to show him up. I just wanted Zach to have something decent. It was stuff like that that really started to grind on Kevin. He didn't like that Zach and Mia were more excited about spending time with us than with him. And it wasn't just about material things either. When they came to our place, they could relax, be themselves, and not have to worry about the chaos going on at home. That's what bothered Kevin the most. The more Kevin lost control of his own family, the more he tried to blame us for it. He'd say stuff like, "You're spoiling them, and it's making them ungrateful." Or, "They're never going to respect me as their father if you keep undermining everything I'm trying to teach them." But what was he really teaching them? How to live in a dysfunctional house with a revolving door of step-siblings and no real support? Yeah, no thanks. Things came to a head when Zach and Mia both told Kevin they didn't want to be around their younger siblings anymore. It was too much. They said they felt like babysitters, always having to look after the little ones while Kevin and Cindy did, well, whatever it is they did. That's when Kevin really started to freak out. He realized that the big happy family he had been trying to force wasn't happening. His older kids didn't want to be part of it, and his younger kids weren't getting any of the attention they needed. It was a total mess. By this point, Kevin was starting to see the walls closing in. His family was gone, Cindy's family was gone, and now Zach and Mia were spending as much time as possible away from him. He was isolated, and he didn't know how to handle it. The more desperate he got, the more he tried to guilt us into helping with the other kids. He said things like, "You're tearing this family apart," or, "If you really cared about Zach and Mia, you'd care about their siblings too." But I wasn't buying it. It wasn't our job to clean up his mess. We were there for Zach and Mia, and that wasn't going to change. Update 2. It all came to a head one weekend when Zach and Mia were staying with us. They'd been spending more time with us lately, and honestly, it was starting to feel like they were avoiding their own house altogether. I didn't mind, of course. We loved having them around, and they seemed happier here than they did at home. But I knew it was only a matter of time before Kevin would make a fuss about it. Sure enough, that Saturday afternoon, Kevin showed up unannounced. He barged in like he owned the place, didn't even bother knocking. I was in the kitchen when I heard the front door slam, and when I went to see what was going on, there he was, standing in the middle of the living room with this angry look on his face. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. "Why are my kids always over here?" I could feel the tension in the room instantly. Zach and Mia were sitting on the couch, eyes wide, not saying a word. My husband stood up from his chair, trying to keep things calm, but you could tell he wasn't happy about the way Kevin had barged in. I didn't raise my voice, but I didn't back down either. "They want to be here, Kevin," I said. "They're welcome here any time, you know that." Kevin shook his head, pacing back and forth. "This isn't right. They're my kids, not yours. They should be spending time with their family, with their siblings, not hiding out here all the time." At this point, Zach stood up, clearly upset. "We're not hiding, Dad. We just want some space." Kevin turned on him, his face red with anger. "Space from what? Your own family? You're always at your grandparents' house, and now your siblings don't even know you anymore. I could see Zach's fists clenching, and I knew this wasn't going to end well if I didn't step in. So I did what I always do. I tried to keep things from exploding. I stepped between them, looking Kevin right in the eye. They're teenagers, Kevin. They need their space. You can't just force them to be around people they don't want to be around. Kevin wasn't having any of it. This is your fault, he snapped. You're spoiling them, giving them everything they want, and now they think they're too good for their own family. You've come between them and their siblings. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything we'd done for Zach and Mia, this guy had the nerve to accuse us of tearing the family apart? I'm not the one who's been pushing them away, Kevin, I said, my voice steady but firm. If Zach and Mia don't feel close to their siblings, that's on you, not us. We've been here for them when you haven't. Kevin looked like he was about to explode. You think you're the hero in all this, don't you? You think just because you have money you can buy their love? Well, it's not working. You're making them ungrateful, and you're turning them against their own family. Now, this is where I had to bite my tongue. My first instinct was to lay into him, to tell him exactly what I thought about his parenting, his choices, his whole attitude, but I knew that wasn't going to help Zach and Mia. So instead, I took a deep breath and said, Kevin, this isn't about money. It's about making sure Zach and Mia are happy and healthy. If they're not close to their siblings, maybe you should look at why that is instead of blaming us. At this point, Zach couldn't stay quiet anymore. He stepped forward, standing next to me. Dad, this isn't about Grandma and Grandpa. We don't feel close to our siblings because we're always taking care of them. We're not their parents, you and Cindy are. But you expect us to be their babysitters all the time, and we're tired of it. Kevin looked stunned. He clearly didn't expect Zach to stand up to him like that. For a moment, it seemed like he was going to back down, but then his anger flared up again. Is that what you think? He said, his voice rising. You think you're too good to help out around the house? That's what family does, Zach. We take care of each other, but you've been too busy playing the spoiled grandkid to even care. I could see Zach's face turning red, and I knew he was on the edge of losing it. But before he could say anything, Mia, who had been quiet this whole time, finally spoke up. We're not spoiled, Dad, she said softly but firmly. We're just tired of being ignored. You and Cindy spend all your time with the little kids, and we're just there, like we don't even matter. So yeah, we like being at Grandma and Grandpa's house because we feel like we actually matter here. Hearing Mia say that, my heart broke a little. She was always the quiet one, the one who kept her feelings to herself. But it was clear now that this had been weighing on her for a long time. Kevin looked like someone had slapped him in the face. He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. For the first time since he'd stormed in, he looked unsure of himself. I took the opportunity to step in again. Kevin, I know this is hard for you, but you can't keep blaming us for the way things are. Zach and Mia love you, but they need you to listen to them, not just tell them what they should be doing. Kevin stood there for a few more seconds, his face going through a whole range of emotions: anger, frustration, maybe even a little guilt. Finally, he just shook his head and turned toward the door. You've made your choice, he muttered, more to himself than to us. You've made them choose. With that, he stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The room was silent for a long moment after he left. Zach and Mia looked shaken, like they couldn't quite believe what had just happened. My husband put a hand on Zach's shoulder. You did good, kid, he said quietly. You stood up for yourself. That's what matters. Zach nodded, but I could see he was still upset. Mia, too. This wasn't how any of us wanted things to go, but at the same time, it felt like something had shifted. For the first time, Zach and Mia had stood up to their dad, and I think they realized that they didn't have to just accept things the way they were anymore. We didn't talk much about it that night. We watched a movie, had some dinner, tried to keep things normal. But I knew that confrontation with Kevin wasn't the end of it. It was just the beginning. Update 3. After that showdown with Kevin, things didn't get any easier. If anything, they got more complicated. Kevin stopped talking to us completely, except when it came to arranging Zach and Mia's visits. And even then, he'd keep things short, cold, like he was doing us a favor by letting them spend time with us. But honestly, I was done trying to make things work with him. My focus was Zach and Mia, and as long as they were happy, I could deal with whatever Kevin threw at us. What really surprised me, though, was how much Zach and Mia started opening up after that fight. It was like once they stood up to Kevin, they finally felt free to talk about everything they'd been holding inside. We had some long conversations during those weekends they stayed with us, and let me tell you, the stuff they'd been dealing with at home was worse than I thought. Zach admitted that he always felt like he was walking on eggshells around Kevin and Cindy. He didn't know how to act in his own house because no matter what he did, it seemed like it was never enough. He was either too distant from his half-siblings or not helpful enough around the house. And when he did step up to help, Kevin would tell him he was doing it wrong. It was a lose-lose situation for him. Mia didn't say as much, but I could tell it was weighing on her too. She told me that Cindy tried to play the cool stepmom, but it always came off as fake. Like Cindy would try to get Mia to talk about stuff or go shopping with her, but Mia could see right through it. She knew Cindy wasn't doing it because she cared about her. She was doing it to make Kevin happy. That realization hurt her more than anything. It wasn't like Zach and Mia didn't want a relationship with their half-siblings. They just didn't feel like they belonged in that new family Kevin was trying so hard to build. They felt like outsiders in their own home, and the more Kevin pushed, the more they pulled away. It was clear to them, and to us, that they were stuck in a situation they never asked for. As much as I hated hearing all this, it made me more determined than ever to give Zach and Mia the space and support they needed. We made sure that when they were with us, they didn't have to think about the chaos back home. I wasn't trying to replace Kevin. I knew that was never going to happen. But I wanted them to know they had a place where they could just be themselves, without all the drama. Then, out of nowhere, Kevin called me up one day. He hadn't spoken to me directly in weeks, so I figured it was important. His tone was different too, less angry, more desperate. I could tell right away that something had shifted. "I need your help," he said, almost like it hurt him to admit it. "I don't know what to do anymore. The kids won't listen to me, and it feels like they hate me." I wasn't sure how to respond at first. Part of me wanted to say, "Well, what did you expect?" But I held back. I knew he wasn't calling for a lecture, even though he probably deserved one. Instead, I asked, "What's going on?" He sighed heavily on the other end of the line. "It's just, they're shutting me out. Zach won't even talk to me unless it's about something practical, and Mia barely looks at me when she's home. Cindy's trying, but they're not warming up to her either. I feel like I'm losing them." I leaned against the counter, trying to process everything he was saying. This was the first time Kevin had ever shown any real vulnerability. It was like he finally realized that all his pushing and controlling wasn't working, and it was costing him his relationship with his kids. "I don't know what you want me to say, Kevin," I said, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. "You tried to force them into something they weren't ready for. You can't just expect them to fall in line." "I know," he said, sounding frustrated. "But I'm trying to fix it. I just don't know how." I thought about it for a moment. Part of me didn't want to get involved. It wasn't my job to fix Kevin's mistakes, and honestly, after everything he'd put us through, I didn't owe him anything. But the other part of me, the part that cared about Zach and Mia, knew that if there was any chance of making things better for them, I had to at least try. "Kevin, you need to listen to them," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Really listen. Stop telling them how they should feel and start asking them how they do feel. They're not little kids anymore. They're teenagers, and they've been through a lot. They need to know you're there for them, not just as their dad, but as someone who cares about what they're going through." There was a long pause on the other end. I could tell he was taking it in, trying to wrap his head around what I was saying. I don't want to lose them," he finally said, his voice almost a whisper. "That's up to you, Kevin," I replied. "But you need to understand that they're not going to come running back just because you ask them to. You have to earn their trust again." After that, Kevin didn't call again for a while. I wasn't sure if he was actually taking my advice or if he was just too proud to admit he needed more help. Either way, things stayed pretty much the same on our end. Zach and Mia continued spending their weekends with us, and they seemed happier for it. But every now and then, I could see that look in their eyes, the one that said they were still dealing with stuff they weren't ready to talk about. Then, about a month later, Zach came to me with something I wasn't expecting. "Grandma," he said, sitting down across from me at the kitchen table, "I've been thinking. I want to move in with you and Grandpa." I blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean, like full-time?" Zach nodded. "Yeah, I can't take it at home anymore. Dad and Cindy are just, it's too much. And Mia's been talking about it too. We're both thinking about it." I didn't know what to say. I mean, of course, I wanted them to stay with us if that's what they needed, but I knew this was going to make things even messier with Kevin. Moving in with us full-time? That would be the final straw for him. "Have you talked to your dad about this?" I asked cautiously. Zach shook his head. "Not yet. I wanted to see if it was even an option before I brought it up. But I can't stay there anymore, Grandma. I just can't." I looked at him, saw the determination in his eyes, and I knew he was serious. This wasn't just some teenage rebellion. This was Zach making a decision about what he needed for his own well-being. "I'll talk to Grandpa," I said slowly, "and then we'll figure out how to bring it up with your dad." Zach nodded, relief washing over his face. "Thanks, Grandma." And in that moment, I realized something. No matter how much Kevin tried to push us away or guilt trip us into doing things his way, Zach and Mia knew where they belonged. They knew they had us in their corner, and that's all that mattered.
"I've decided that my mother will be moving in with us next week," Kevin declared, his eyes locking onto mine. I nearly choked on my coffee. "Excuse me? Without discussing it with me?" "We can't have her here," I rebutted, my voice trembling with a mix of shock and anger. Kevin leaned back, unfazed by my reaction. "It's not up for discussion, Jenna. Mom's been through a lot since Dad passed, and she needs our support." My heart raced as I processed his words. Elaine, Kevin's overbearing mother, moving in? The mere thought sent shivers down my spine. "But this is our home, Kevin. We should have talked about this first." He scoffed, dismissing my concerns with a wave of his hand. "Don't be dramatic. It's just temporary until she gets back on her feet." I bit my tongue, knowing from experience that arguing further would be futile. Kevin had made up his mind, and my opinion didn't matter. Still, I couldn't shake the sinking feeling that this would be the beginning of a nightmare. As the days ticked by, the knot in my stomach tightened. I thought back to when Kevin and I first met, how charming and attentive he was. But over the years, that spark had faded, replaced by a growing indifference and a prioritization of his own needs over our relationship. The morning of Elaine's arrival, I braced myself. But nothing could have prepared me for the chaos that ensued. Movers poured in, hauling not just a few suitcases, but an entire household's worth of belongings. "What's all this?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the commotion. Elaine swept in, her presence as domineering as ever. "Well, dear, I couldn't possibly leave my precious belongings behind. This is just temporary, after all." I shot Kevin a pleading look, but he simply shrugged, already retreating into his usual detached state. As the movers began rearranging our living room to accommodate Elaine's furniture, I knew my life as I knew it was over. That evening, I called Megan, my best friend and confidant. Tears streamed down my face as I poured out my frustrations, feeling more alone than ever in my own home. "I don't know what to do, Meg," I confessed. "It's like Kevin doesn't even see me anymore. And now, with his mother here, I feel like an outsider." Megan's soothing voice offered little comfort. "You have to stand your ground, Jen. This is your home too, and you can't let them walk all over you." But as the days turned into weeks, Elaine's presence became increasingly suffocating. She took over my kitchen, rearranged my carefully curated decor, and inserted herself into every aspect of our lives. Meanwhile, Kevin's emotional distance grew, and he started spending more and more time away from home, leaving me to fend for myself against his mother's intrusions. With each passing day, Elaine's presence grew more oppressive, her tentacles snaking into every nook and cranny of our once peaceful home. No matter how hard I tried to establish boundaries, she bulldozed right through them, treating our space as her personal kingdom. "Jenna, dear, don't you think these curtains would look better over there?" she'd say, already rearranging my carefully chosen decor without waiting for a response. Kevin, true to form, remained oblivious to my mounting frustrations. Whenever I tried to broach the subject, he'd brush me off with a dismissive, "Mom's just settling in," or "She means well." Meanwhile, his absences from home became more frequent and prolonged. Business trips, he'd claim, but I couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that something more sinister was afoot. One evening, as I pored over our bank statements, a disturbing pattern emerged. Large sums of money, thousands upon thousands, had been steadily disappearing from our joint accounts. My heart raced as I cross-referenced the dates with Kevin's supposed business trips. Desperate for answers, I reached out to an old acquaintance, Greg Wilson, a private investigator with a reputation for discretion. If Kevin was up to no good, Greg would uncover the truth. "I need you to tail my husband," I whispered into the phone, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. "I think he's hiding something from me." Greg agreed without hesitation, and the following weeks were a whirlwind of clandestine meetings and hushed conversations as he fed me crumbs of information. "Your husband's been frequenting some unsavory establishments," he reported one afternoon, sliding a manila envelope across the table. Inside were grainy photographs of Kevin entering a seedy-looking casino, his face obscured but his gait unmistakable. My world shattered in that moment, the realization hitting me like a ton of bricks. Kevin, the man I had once loved and trusted, was gambling away our savings, our future, all while letting his mother infiltrate and undermine our home. Confronting him was an exercise in futility. "You're overreacting, as usual," he sneered, his eyes cold and devoid of remorse. "If you can't accept the way things are, then maybe you should leave." The venom in his words stung, but I refused to back down. This was my life, my home, and I would be damned if I let him and his wretched mother take it all away from me. With trembling hands, I dialed Megan's number, my voice thick with unshed tears. "I need your help," I choked out. "Kevin, he's been lying to me, stealing from me, and his mother, she's taken over everything." Megan, bless her soul, didn't hesitate. "Pack a bag and come stay with me," she urged. "We'll figure this out together, I promise." As I stuffed my belongings into a suitcase, a newfound sense of determination washed over me. Kevin and Elaine had crossed a line, and they would pay for their betrayal. This was just the beginning. Elaine's domination of our home only intensified after I moved in with Megan. Like a malignant tumor, she metastasized into every corner, leaving no space untouched by her overbearing presence. "That woman has no boundaries," Megan fumed as I recounted the latest indignity. Elaine had redecorated our bedroom without permission, tossing out cherished mementos in favor of her gaudy knickknacks. I could only nod, the lump in my throat threatening to choke me. Kevin's betrayal cut deeper than any wound, but it was his mother's insidious meddling that twisted the knife. With each passing day, Kevin grew more distant, his visits to the house growing increasingly rare. When he did show up, it was like a ghost drifting through, offering little more than a cursory greeting before disappearing into the night. "Working late," he'd mumble, his eyes downcast, unable to meet my gaze. I knew better. Greg's surveillance had painted a clear picture. Kevin was frittering away our hard-earned savings at underground gambling dens, chasing a thrill that no amount of money could satisfy. Desperate to stem the bleeding, I took matters into my own hands. I changed the locks, froze our joint accounts, and even went so far as to cancel Kevin's credit cards. Anything to halt his reckless spending before he bled us dry. Elaine, of course, was apoplectic. "How dare you?" she shrieked, her voice shrill enough to shatter glass. "This is my son's home, and you have no right." For once, I stood my ground, emboldened by the knowledge that I held the moral high ground. "Your son has been lying and stealing from me," I spat back, my words laced with venom. "If he wants back in, he'll have to earn it." Kevin's response was predictable, a flurry of anger and denial, punctuated by the occasional guilt trip. "You're overreacting as always," he sneered. "If you loved me, you'd trust me." But I was done being manipulated. With Megan's unwavering support, I dug in my heels, determined to uncover the full extent of his misdeeds. It was a war of attrition, with Elaine and Kevin launching salvo after salvo of emotional and psychological attacks. But I was no longer the meek, deferential wife they thought they knew. This was my life, my home, and I would fight tooth and nail to protect it. Each night, as I lay awake in Megan's spare room, my mind raced with possibilities. How far had Kevin's deception gone? What other secrets lurked beneath the surface? And, perhaps most pressing of all, how could I make them pay for their betrayal? Revenge, once a fleeting thought, had now taken root, a burning ember that I stoked with each fresh indignity. Kevin and Elaine had awoken a fury within me, and by God, they would reap the whirlwind. As the weeks dragged on, my suspicions about Kevin's financial misdeeds only deepened. Despite my efforts to cut off his access to funds, he always seemed to have a steady stream of cash flowing in, money that couldn't be explained by his legitimate income alone. It was Megan who first pointed out the discrepancies. "Look at this," she said, her brow furrowed as she pored over the bank statements I'd managed to obtain. "These deposits don't add up. There's no way he could be earning this much from his job alone." My heart sank as the realization hit me. Kevin was up to something far more nefarious than mere gambling. He was embezzling, siphoning off money from who knows where to fund his vices and Elaine's extravagant lifestyle. With Megan's help, I dug deeper, combing through financial records and piecing together a paper trail that painted an increasingly damning picture. Kevin had been skimming funds from his company's accounts, using his position as a trusted manager to cover his tracks. The evidence was mounting, but I needed more. I needed irrefutable proof, something that would hold up in court and ensure that Kevin and his wretched mother couldn't weasel their way out of facing the consequences. That's when I turned to Greg again. "I need you to follow the money trail," I instructed, my voice steely with determination. "Whatever it takes, we need to know where these funds are coming from and where they're going." Greg didn't disappoint. Through a combination of surveillance and good old-fashioned gumshoe work, he uncovered a web of deceit so intricate, so meticulously constructed, that it left me reeling. Kevin, it seemed, had been running a complex embezzlement scheme for years, funneling money into offshore accounts and using shell corporations to launder the ill-gotten gains. And at the center of it all was Elaine, the puppet master pulling the strings, using her son's greed and her own manipulative ways to bankroll their lavish lifestyle. As the pieces fell into place, a white-hot fury burned within me. These people, the ones who were supposed to be my family, had betrayed me in the most despicable way imaginable. They had stolen from me, lied to me, and tried to strip me of my dignity and self-worth. But not anymore. Clutching the thick dossier of evidence that Greg had compiled, I steeled myself for the confrontation I knew was coming. Kevin and Elaine thought they had me backed into a corner, but they were about to learn just how wrong they were. When they arrived at Megan's apartment, their usual arrogance was on full display. Elaine swept in first, her nose turned up in disdain, while Kevin trailed behind, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Well, look who finally decided to grace us with her presence," Elaine sneered, her eyes narrowing as she took in my defiant stance. Kevin, ever the smooth talker, tried a different tack. "Jenna, please, let's be reasonable here. This has all been a big misunderstanding." I said nothing, simply tossing the dossier onto the coffee table with a loud thud. "Reasonable? You want to talk about being reasonable?" I spat, my voice dripping with contempt. "How about you explain these?" As they leafed through the damning evidence, their smug expressions melted away, replaced by a mixture of fear and outrage. For once, they were the ones left speechless, their carefully constructed lies unraveling before their very eyes. The satisfaction I felt in that moment was overwhelming. Finally, after months of torment and gaslighting, the tables had turned. Kevin and Elaine were the ones backed into a corner, their misdeeds laid bare for all to see. And I was just getting started. The look of stunned disbelief on Kevin and Elaine's faces was almost comical, if the situation hadn't been so deadly serious. As they flipped through the damning evidence, their mouths agape, I could practically see the gears turning in their twisted minds, desperately searching for a way to wriggle out of this mess they'd created. But there would be no escape. Not this time. I had them dead to rights, their web of lies and deceit exposed for all to see. "How did you get this?" Kevin stammered, his usual smooth demeanor cracking under the weight of the truth. I fixed him with a steely gaze, reveling in his discomfort. "Does it matter? The real question is, what are you going to do about it?" Elaine, ever the master manipulator, tried a different tack. "Jenna, darling, surely we can work something out," she cooed, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "This is all just a big misunderstanding." I scoffed, my fury rising like a tidal wave. "A misunderstanding? You really expect me to believe that?" I spat, gesturing to the damning evidence laid out before us. "You've been bleeding me dry for years, living off my hard-earned money while treating me like a doormat in my own home." Kevin's eyes narrowed, his mask of charm melting away to reveal the true monster beneath. "Watch your tone," he snarled, his voice low and menacing. "You're the one who's been making things difficult, constantly questioning my decisions and undermining my authority." The sheer audacity of his words left me momentarily speechless. Undermining his authority? As if he had any right to wield authority over me, after the way he'd betrayed me time and time again. Megan, bless her soul, stepped in before I could unleash the full force of my fury. "I think it's time for you two to leave," she said firmly, her gaze fixed on Kevin and Elaine with barely contained contempt. Elaine opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off with a sharp gesture. "No, let them stay," I said. my voice laced with a cold, calculated anger. I want them to hear this. Taking a deep breath, I laid it all out, every sordid detail, every lie, every act of theft and betrayal. I spared no punches, letting the full weight of their misdeeds crash down upon them like a tidal wave. As I spoke, I could see the smug arrogance slipping from their faces, replaced by a dawning realization that this time they had gone too far. This time, there would be consequences. "So here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice steely and unwavering. "You're going to pack up your things and get out of my house. Every last penny you've stolen will be repaid, with interest. And if you so much as breathe a word of protest, I'll make sure the authorities get a nice, neat package detailing every illegal thing you've done." Silence hung heavy in the air, the weight of my ultimatum sinking in. For a brief moment, I thought Kevin might try to bluster his way out, to hurl threats and insults in a desperate bid to regain control. But then, in a move that surprised us all, Elaine deflated, the fight draining from her eyes. "Fine," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll go." Kevin, ever the dutiful son, followed her lead, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As they gathered their belongings and shuffled out the door, I felt a surge of triumph unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I had won. Against all odds, I had faced down the very people who had tried to destroy me, and I had emerged victorious. The road ahead would be long and arduous, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could see a glimmer of hope on the horizon. Kevin and Elaine would face the full consequences of their actions. Of that, I was certain. And as for me, well, I was just getting started. With Kevin and Elaine gone, a weight lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in months, I could breathe freely, unburdened by their toxic presence, but my work was far from over. I needed to ensure they faced the full consequences of their actions. Megan, ever the loyal friend, was by my side every step of the way. "We need to gather allies," she said, her brow furrowed in determination. "People who can corroborate your story, who can testify to Kevin's misdeeds." It was a tall order, but Megan was right. If we were going to take down Kevin and Elaine, we needed strength in numbers. And so we began reaching out to anyone who might have witnessed their duplicity firsthand. To my surprise, the responses poured in, a steady stream of people eager to share their own stories of mistreatment at the hands of my former in-laws. Kevin's coworkers, friends, even distant relatives, all had tales to tell of his arrogance, his greed, and his utter disregard for anyone but himself and his precious mother. As the accounts mounted, a picture began to emerge, one of a man so consumed by his own ambition and entitlement that he would stop at nothing to get what he wanted, trampling over anyone who dared stand in his way. With each new revelation, my resolve hardened. These people, these victims, deserved justice as much as I did, and I would be the one to deliver it, no matter the cost. The plan was simple, yet audacious. We would gather our allies, our evidence, and our collective fury and unleash it all in one fell swoop. A public spectacle, a reckoning of sorts, where Kevin and Elaine would be forced to confront the full weight of their misdeeds. The opportunity presented itself in the form of a company gala, a lavish affair that Kevin had once reveled in, strutting about like a peacock in his designer suits and basking in the admiration of his peers. This time, however, the tables would be turned. As the guests arrived, dressed to the nines and sipping champagne, a palpable buzz of anticipation hung in the air. They knew something was afoot, but few could have predicted the bombshell that was about to drop. When the moment was right, I took the stage, my heart pounding in my chest. With Megan and our assembled allies flanking me, I laid it all bare. The lies, the deceit, the embezzlement, and the emotional torment that Kevin and Elaine had inflicted upon us all. The reaction was instant and visceral. Gasps of shock and horror rippled through the crowd, punctuated by the occasional cry of outrage. As I spoke, presenting the meticulously collected evidence, I could see the realization dawning on their faces. The man they had once admired, the man they had trusted, was nothing more than a fraud, a snake in the grass. And then, like a coup de grace, I unveiled the final piece of the puzzle. Video footage, obtained through Megan's resourcefulness, of Kevin and Elaine brazenly spending their ill-gotten gains on lavish vacations and extravagant purchases, all while pretending to be pillars of the community. The silence that followed was deafening. a collective intake of breath as the full scope of their betrayal sank in. And in that moment, I knew we had won. Kevin and Elaine, their faces twisted into masks of rage and humiliation, could do nothing but slink away, their reputations in tatters, their carefully constructed facade crumbling around them. As the dust settled and the crowd dispersed, murmuring in disbelief, I felt a sense of profound catharsis wash over me. The path ahead would be long and arduous, but for the first time in years, I could see a light at the end of the tunnel. Kevin and Elaine would face the legal consequences of their actions, of that I was certain. But more importantly, they would never again be able to inflict their poison on anyone else. Their reign of terror was over, and I, Jenna Taylor, had been the one to bring them to their knees. It was a victory hard won, but oh how sweet it tasted. The fallout from the disastrous gala was swift and merciless. Within days, Kevin had been unceremoniously fired from his cushy corporate job, his reputation in tatters. Elaine, too, found herself cast out from the social circles she had once lorded over, her name now synonymous with greed and deceit. As for me, I watched their downfall with a mixture of satisfaction and grim determination. This was just the beginning. The first step in holding them accountable for the pain and suffering they had inflicted upon me and so many others. With the evidence we had painstakingly gathered, it was only a matter of time before the legal system caught up to them. My lawyer, a bulldog of a woman named Samantha, wasted no time in filing charges for embezzlement, fraud, and a host of other white-collar crimes. They'll try to wriggle their way out of this. You know, Samantha warned me, her steely gaze fixed on the mountain of documentation before us. People like them always do. They'll plead ignorance, shift blame, anything to avoid taking responsibility. I nodded grimly, my jaw set. Then we'll be ready. We'll make sure they can't escape the consequences of their actions, not this time. True to Samantha's prediction, Kevin and Elaine fought like cornered animals, deploying every legal maneuver and underhanded tactic in their arsenal. But we were prepared, our case airtight and our resolve unshakable. As the legal proceedings dragged on, I took a perverse pleasure in watching their once lavish lifestyle crumble around them. The fancy cars, the designer clothes, the ostentatious jewelry, all of it was slowly stripped away, piece by piece, as their assets were seized and their ill-gotten gains clawed back. Elaine, in particular, seemed to take the loss of her material trappings the hardest. I'll never forget the look of abject horror on her face as the movers carted away her precious antiques and curios, the very things she had prioritized over basic human decency. "You'll pay for this, you ungrateful wretch," she screeched at me, her eyes wild and her perfectly coiffed hair askew. "You've ruined us, destroyed everything we built." I met her vitriol with a steely calm unbowed by her theatrics. "You did this to yourselves," I replied, my voice level. All I did was expose the truth. Kevin, ever the more composed of the two, tried a different tack. In the rare moments when we found ourselves face to face, he would adopt a sickly sweet tone, his words dripping with false sincerity. "Jenna, please, let's put all this nastiness behind us," he would implore, his eyes pleading. "We're family, after all. Surely we can work something out for old time's sake." But I was no longer the naive, easily manipulated woman he had once known. The scales had fallen from my eyes, and I saw him for what he truly was, a snake, a parasite who had fed off my kindness and trust for far too long. "Save your breath, Kevin," I would reply, my voice laced with contempt. "The only thing we have to work out is how much time you'll be serving." And serve time he did, along with his precious mother. As the legal proceedings reached their climax, the weight of the evidence proved too overwhelming to ignore. Kevin was slapped with a lengthy prison sentence for his financial crimes, while Elaine received a hefty fine and probation for her role in the scheme. As they were led away in handcuffs, I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. For too long, these people had operated with impunity, trampling over anyone who dared stand in their way. But no more. They had finally been brought to heel, their lofty airs and delusions of grandeur shattered. It was a bittersweet victory, to be sure. The scars they had inflicted upon me would never fully heal, and the months of anguish and betrayal could never be undone. But in that moment, as I watched them being hauled off to face the consequences of their actions, I knew that I had emerged from this ordeal stronger, more resilient, and more determined than ever before. Kevin and Elaine had tried to break me, but in the end, it was I who had broken them. With Kevin and Elaine finally behind bars, a weight lifted from my shoulders. The long, arduous battle had taken its toll, but I had emerged victorious. Battered, perhaps, but unbroken. As I stood in the spacious living room of my new apartment, surveying the sleek minimalist decor, I couldn't help but marvel at how far I'd come. This fresh start, this sanctuary of my own making, was a testament to my resilience, a tangible reminder that I had reclaimed control of my life. The road here had been paved with hardship and heartache, but also with the unwavering support of those who truly mattered. Megan, my rock through it all, had been by my side every step of the way, offering her steadfast friendship and sage advice whenever the doubts crept in. And then there was Scarlett, my cousin, whose generosity had made this new beginning possible. When she'd heard of my plight, she hadn't hesitated to offer me the keys to this stunning high-rise apartment, a sanctuary far removed from the toxic memories of my former life. "Consider it a fresh start," she had insisted, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and concern. "You've been through hell, Jenna. It's time you had a place of your own, a place where you can heal and rebuild." As I unpacked the final box, carefully arranging my cherished mementos on the sleek shelves, I couldn't help but reflect on the long, winding path that had brought me here. The betrayal, the anguish, the all-consuming fury, it had all been worth it, if only to arrive at this moment of hard-won peace. Of course, not everyone had been so fortunate. Kevin and Elaine, those architects of my suffering, were now behind bars, their grand delusions of wealth and status reduced to a distant memory. From what I'd heard through the grapevine, their fall from grace had been steep and unforgiving. Kevin, once the smooth-talking corporate climber, had been reduced to a hollow shell of a man, his bravado evaporating in the harsh reality of prison life. Elaine, too, had found herself adrift, her once formidable social standing decimated by the revelations of her misdeeds. A small, petty part of me relished in their misery, reveled in the knowledge that they were finally getting a taste of the pain and humiliation they had so callously inflicted upon me and others. But as the days turned into weeks, that vindictive urge faded, replaced by a sense of weary acceptance. They had been the masters of their own undoing, their greed and hubris ultimately proving to be their downfall. As for me, I had emerged from the crucible tempered and anew, ready to forge a life truly worth living. The housewarming party that Megan had insisted on throwing was a testament to just how far I'd come. As I surveyed the gathered crowd of friends, old and new, I was struck by the outpouring of love and support. "To Jenna," Megan declared, raising her glass in a toast, "the strongest, most resilient woman I know. You've been through hell and back, but you never gave up. You never let the bastards grind you down." A chorus of cheers and laughter erupted, buoying my spirits and filling me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. These people, these wonderful, caring individuals, were my true family, the ones who had stood by me when the chips were down, who had believed in me even when I had doubted myself. As the night wore on and the laughter and conversation flowed, I found myself reflecting on the long, winding journey that had brought me to this moment. The pain, the heartache, the soul-crushing betrayal, it had all been a crucible, a trial by fire that had forged me into the woman I was today. And as I looked around at the smiling faces of my friends, my chosen family, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I would face them head-on, unbowed and unbroken. For I was Jenna Taylor, survivor and warrior, and my story was just beginning.
My entitled wife disappeared after a girls' trip. Years later, she showed up at my doorstep with a baby. So I destroyed her life. You know how people always say things like, "I never saw it coming"? Well, that's exactly how it was for me. My wife and I were together for a solid 4 years, married for all of it. I honestly thought we had a good thing going. We had plans, a whole life mapped out, and for the most part, I really thought we were on the same page. Now here's the thing. We both wanted kids, or at least I thought we both did. Right after we got married, we started talking about it seriously. She'd always say how she wanted 2 or 3 kids, kept going on about what we'd name them, how we'd decorate the nursery, the whole thing. She'd even sit online looking at baby clothes and baby gadgets, planning this life with our future kids. It was kind of our thing to talk about it, something that kept us close. So, we were excited, ready to start this next chapter together, and everything seemed perfect. But then, we got hit with some bad news that just knocked the wind out of me. After a few months of trying to have kids, we went to a doctor to see what was going on. Long story short, it was me. My count was way too low, and the doctor basically told us that the chances of us having kids naturally were slim to none. It was like a punch to the gut. I felt useless. All those plans we had, just gone in an instant. The news hit me hard, like really hard. I ended up in a pretty bad place for a while. Therapy eventually helped, but at the start I was a total mess. She seemed pretty supportive at first, saying it didn't matter and that she'd be happy with just the two of us. But even from the beginning, there was something off about how she said it. It's like she just dropped it way too quickly. One minute, she was all about having a family, and the next, she's saying she didn't need kids to be happy. Now, don't get me wrong, I get that people change their minds. But her whole attitude felt weird to me. She'd gone from daydreaming about baby names to just flat out avoiding any talk about kids. And not just that, it was like she started seeing me differently too. Out of nowhere, she'd make these small digs at me, stuff she'd never said before. Comments about how I wasn't taking care of myself, how maybe I should get in shape or be more productive around the house. And yeah, maybe I'd put on a few pounds, but it was like she was just finding things to blame me for. When I confronted her, asking what was up with the sudden attitude change, she'd brush it off. She'd tell me I was imagining things, that I was just being overly sensitive. But I knew something was up. The woman I married, the one who used to sit with me for hours talking about our future, she was different. She wasn't mean exactly, but there was this coldness, like she'd already checked out mentally and was just going through the motions. And over time, I guess I started to believe her when she said everything was fine. I stopped pushing because I didn't want to come across as insecure or needy. Anyway, fast forward a few years and we were just living day by day. We'd fallen into this routine where we barely talked about anything meaningful. It was like we were roommates more than husband and wife. I tried bringing up other options, adoption, surrogacy, but every time she'd shut it down, saying she didn't want to think about it. She'd say, "I'm happy as long as we're together." But I never fully bought it. It felt like she was trying to convince herself more than me. Then, out of nowhere, she tells me she wants to go on a girls' trip. Now, it wasn't unusual for her to go on trips with her friends. She'd done it a few times before, and I always supported her. We lived in Brighton, and she'd talk about how she wanted to go to America with her friends for a while. I didn't think twice about it because we'd built up this trust over the years. So, I even helped her pack, made sure she had everything she needed, and dropped her off at the airport. I remember the last thing she said before she left. She turned to me and said, "Thank you for being so supportive." I thought it was a little weird that she'd say that. It's not like I'd done anything special. But she seemed so genuine, so I brushed it off as her just being appreciative. That night, I stayed up so I could call her once she landed, just to make sure everything went smoothly. Her flight was supposed to take about 9 hours, so I kept myself busy around the house, watching TV, checking the clock, and waiting for her to text me that she'd landed. Once I saw her flight had touched down, I gave her a call to check in. The phone rang and rang, but no answer. I figured she was tired, maybe went straight to her hotel and crashed, so I didn't think too much of it. But then, morning rolled around, and I still hadn't heard from her. I started feeling this gnawing worry in the pit of my stomach. I tried calling again. Then I sent a few texts, thinking maybe she was just busy or her phone was on silent. But after a few more hours of radio silence, I was officially freaking out. I ended up calling her sister to see if maybe she'd heard from her. Nothing. By now, I was seriously starting to panic. I even went as far as calling her friends, the ones who were supposed to be on the trip with her, thinking maybe something had gone wrong with her phone, or maybe she just hadn't had the chance to check in. But when I called them, they were confused too, because they weren't on the trip with her. They were sitting 2 blocks away, back home, having coffee. That was when it really hit me. She wasn't on a girls' trip. She wasn't with friends. She hadn't gone anywhere with anyone. She was just gone. I sat there, holding the phone, and it felt like my stomach dropped through the floor. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Why would she lie to me like that? Why would she just leave without telling me? I tried to convince myself it was some kind of mistake, like maybe she'd missed a connecting flight, or there'd been some emergency and she hadn't been able to call. But deep down, I knew. She'd planned this, the whole girls' trip thing, her saying thank you for being supportive. It was all part of whatever she'd been cooking up in her head. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was living in some nightmare where I couldn't wake up. This wasn't the woman I'd married. This was someone I didn't even recognize. All the pieces started clicking together, the coldness, the way she'd stopped talking about our future, those little jabs about my looks and my health. She'd been pulling away for a long time, and I just hadn't seen it. Or maybe I hadn't wanted to see it. That night, I just sat there staring at my phone, hoping for a text, a call, anything. But nothing came, and deep down I knew it wouldn't. Waking up the next morning, I remember just lying there, staring at the ceiling, hoping maybe it was all some messed up dream. But her side of the bed was empty, and reality hit hard. She'd actually left. She'd packed her bags and vanished, and all those reassurances I'd told myself the night before, that maybe she was delayed or her phone died, they didn't hold up anymore. It was obvious she'd planned this and wanted out. The first few days, I was in total denial. I'd keep calling her phone, hoping I'd hear her voice on the other end, maybe get an explanation. I even left messages. I didn't know what to say half the time, but I kept leaving them, hoping something would get through to her. But all I got was silence, which somehow made it feel worse. It's like I was left to figure it out on my own, with no idea what went wrong, like I was a stranger to her all along. At first, her family was as shocked as I was. Her mom didn't know anything about her plans, and they hadn't heard from her either. I ended up going over there more times than I could count, talking to her mom, looking for answers. I think they felt bad for me. Her mom would let me crash there some nights, even made me meals when I couldn't bring myself to cook. She'd sit there, listening to me talk about all the little things that didn't make sense, trying to piece together how my life had blown up without warning. And I'll be honest, sometimes I just sat there in silence, too numb to say anything. I went from one extreme to another: anger, sadness, guilt. I'd keep asking myself what I did wrong. Did I miss some sign? Did I not give her enough attention? There were days I'd go over every conversation we'd had, every fight, trying to figure out what pushed her to leave. I kept running through my mind how I might have saved our marriage, what I could have done differently. I know it sounds dramatic, but I was obsessed with figuring it out, like finding an answer could somehow fix everything. I barely ate, barely slept, and my work started slipping too. People noticed. They'd ask if I was okay, and I'd just shrug it off, say I was dealing with personal stuff. It was embarrassing to admit what had happened, to say out loud that my wife left me without a word. Eventually, I did tell a couple of close friends, and they did their best to keep me distracted, dragging me out to hang out, trying to get me to move on. But even when I was with them, I'd be in my head, thinking about her, wondering where she was and why I wasn't enough to make her stay. One of the worst parts was the constant questions from people who didn't know. Neighbors, family friends, even old coworkers who'd heard I was married would ask, "How's married life treating you?" And "How's your wife?" Every time it was like ripping off a fresh scab. I didn't have the guts to tell them she'd left, so I'd just smile, say everything was fine. But that lie felt heavier every time I told it. Therapy ended up being the only thing that helped. I'd never gone before, but after a few months of barely functioning, I knew I couldn't handle it on my own anymore. So I found a therapist and started going every week. Talking to someone neutral, someone who didn't know her or me or any of our baggage, it helped. I'd vent about the anger, the betrayal, the hole she'd left in my life. I'd go on about the sleepless nights, how I'd lie awake replaying everything over and over. The therapist helped me see that there was no magic moment that would have kept her here. She made the choice to leave, and that was on her, not me. That was a hard pill to swallow. For the longest time, I felt like there was something wrong with me, that I'd somehow driven her away. But slowly, I started seeing things differently. She'd been cold and distant for a long time, and I'd just ignored it, hoping things would get better on their own. I'd convinced myself that I could hold it all together, that somehow my effort alone was enough to keep our marriage alive. It was painful to accept that it wasn't. As time went on, I started taking small steps to rebuild my life. I'd lost a lot of myself in our marriage, and I hadn't realized it until she left. I'd always been the guy who made an effort, who'd go out of his way to make sure she was happy, to make sure our home life was comfortable. But now, I had all this time on my hands, and I didn't know what to do with it, so I started picking up old hobbies again, stuff I'd forgotten about. I went to the gym, started reading books I'd been putting off, even tried cooking new recipes. Work eventually got better too. At first, I was just going through the motions, barely keeping up with my workload. But as I started feeling more like myself, I put more effort into my job. It was one of the few things that made me feel accomplished, like I still had control over something in my life. I'd always been good at what I did, but now I put my all into it. The extra hours, the focus, it paid off in the form of a promotion that I never would have gotten if I'd been wallowing in self-pity. Still, there were days that hurt. Every once in a while, I'd come across something that reminded me of her, a photo, an old movie ticket stub, little things that brought back memories I'd tried to forget. I'd look at them and wonder what she was doing, if she ever thought about me, if she ever regretted what she did. But those moments started to fade, bit by bit. Each time, I was able to pack away those memories a little quicker, move on a little easier. I also reconnected with friends I hadn't seen much since I got married. We started doing things again, hitting up the golf range, going on hikes, stuff I hadn't done in years. It felt good to have people in my corner, people who weren't part of the mess, who could help me move on without dragging me back into the pain. Looking back, I realized I'd put way too much of myself into that relationship, into being her husband. When she left, it felt like she'd taken a part of me with her, like I'd lost this huge chunk of who I was. But piece by piece, I was finding myself again. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but I was getting there. By the end of that year, I could finally look in the mirror and see someone who wasn't defined by what she'd done. I was more than just the guy whose wife left him. I'd survived, I'd rebuilt, and I'd come out stronger. For the first time in years, I felt like I could actually live my life without her shadow hanging over me. And honestly, I was proud of that. I thought I'd put everything behind me. Life had finally started feeling normal again, or at least as close to normal as it could get after all that mess. I had my routine down, friends keeping me busy, and work was actually going great. I'd even stopped thinking about her every day. I mean, I still had my moments where some random memory would sneak up on me, but it wasn't like before, where every second of my life was somehow connected to her. So when there was a knock on my door one Saturday morning, she was the last person I expected to see standing there. But there she was, right on my doorstep, holding a baby. I froze. My brain just stopped working for a second, because it was like seeing a ghost. She looked pretty much the same, maybe a little worn down, but still her. She gave me this look like she actually thought I'd be happy to see her. And yeah, that hit me hard because I thought I was past caring. Turns out, seeing her again stirred up a lot of emotions I thought I'd buried. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, staring. She smiled at me, like nothing had happened. And then, with zero shame, she asked, "Can I come in?" The nerve. I mean, really, after everything she'd done, she just shows up here like I'm supposed to welcome her back with open arms. But I kept my cool, told her, "No, you can stay right there and explain." I didn't want her in my house, bringing all that chaos back into the place I'd built up again, the one space I'd made mine. She looked a bit thrown off, but she stayed where she was and just dove into her story. She started with, "I know this might be a shock, but I wanted to come back and explain everything." She even had this hopeful look on her face, as if she genuinely believed I'd be open to hearing her out. I was torn between laughing in her face and just shutting the door right there. But I was too curious. I wanted to know what her excuse was, what she'd come up with to justify the way she'd vanished. She went on, talking about how she'd made a mistake leaving, how she'd realized she'd lost the best thing that had ever happened to her. Her words, not mine. She said she'd spent a lot of time reflecting, and that after having this baby, she finally understood what really mattered in life. Apparently, what really mattered was showing up unannounced at my door after ghosting me for years, and that's when she looked down at the baby and said, "This is our second chance." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Our second chance? Like this kid was supposed to be some magical reset button and we'd just pick up right where we left off? I tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside I was absolutely fuming. She went on, saying how she wanted us to be a family again, that she'd made a terrible mistake, but now we could start fresh, just the three of us. Finally, I asked the one question that had been eating at me since she showed up. "Why did you leave?" I kept my voice as steady as I could, but I wasn't sure how much longer I'd be able to hold back. I'd spent years trying to understand, torturing myself with all the possibilities, and now that she was here, I needed to hear it from her. She hesitated, looking down at her feet like she was ashamed. But eventually, she told me the truth, or what I assume was the truth. She admitted she'd left because she wanted a kid, and since I couldn't give her one, she'd found someone who could. She actually said it like it was no big deal, as if she hadn't shattered my life, as if I was supposed to just nod and accept it. She explained that the guy she'd left with didn't stick around, but by then she'd had the baby and realized she wanted me back. Just like that. Simple. I took a minute to process what she was saying. Here she was, admitting that she'd abandoned me, ran off with some guy, had his kid, and now expected me to be okay with it, like I just forgive and forget. I told her, "So you left, found someone else, had his baby, and now you think you can come back and pretend like nothing happened?" She started crying, saying she was sorry, that she'd made a huge mistake, but that didn't move me at all. She kept saying how she realized that I was the one she truly loved, and that we were meant to be together. Honestly, it was hard to keep a straight face. I couldn't believe how delusional she sounded. This wasn't love. This was desperation, and I could see it all over her face. Then she tried to guilt trip me, going on about how it wasn't easy being a single mom, how hard it had been for her. She actually tried to make herself the victim in all this, as if her choices hadn't led to exactly where she was now. She told me she needed my support, that she was ready to make things work this time. The whole time I just kept thinking, who does she think I am? I stood there, taking it all in, but at this point, I was done listening. I told her straight up, look, you made your choice a long time ago, and now you have to live with it. There's no second chance here. She looked stunned, like she'd never even considered that I'd say no, like she really thought she could just waltz back into my life because it was convenient for her. And then, just when I thought she'd finally get it and leave, she got mad. Her tone changed, and she started yelling at me, saying I was being selfish, that I owed her a chance to make things right. She said that if she'd wanted to, she could have divorced me back then and taken half of everything. She even had the nerve to bring up the house, saying it should still be hers. It was like her true colors were coming out right in front of me, and I felt this wave of relief. I was finally seeing her for who she really was. I didn't argue with her. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at her and said, we're done. You wanted a different life, and now you have it. This isn't my responsibility anymore. With that, I shut the door in her face, cutting off whatever final words she had left. Standing there, hearing her muffled shouts from the other side of the door, I felt this strange calm wash over me. She could knock, yell, cry, whatever. But I knew I'd never let her back in. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd married, she was gone. And in her place was this stranger who thought she could pick up the pieces when it suited her. I walked away from the door and sat down, feeling lighter than I had in years. After I slammed the door on her, I thought that was it. I figured she'd get the message and just leave. But no. Instead, she started banging on the door, yelling all kinds of things. I couldn't believe the nerve. There I was, in the one place that was mine, the one place I'd managed to rebuild from the mess she'd left me in, and she had the audacity to stand there, demanding I listen to her. At first, I thought about ignoring it, just letting her scream until she got tired. But then I got curious. I wanted to hear what kind of reasons she'd come up with this time. So, I opened the door, just a crack, enough to show her that I was listening but not letting her in. She looked like she'd just taken a slap to the face, probably shocked that I hadn't given her the reaction she wanted. She launched into this whole monologue about how she was willing to forgive me for slamming the door on her and how she was ready to start fresh, like we were just having a normal spat, not dealing with her abandonment. She kept going on about how we could make things work if we both put in the effort. At that point, I couldn't hold back. I laughed, actually laughed, because the sheer nerve of this woman was beyond anything I'd ever seen. She looked furious when I did that, like I was supposed to feel bad for not taking her seriously. I told her, you left. You had your chance and you threw it all away. I'm not just going to pretend none of that happened because you feel like it. Her face went red, and she started saying things like, you don't understand how hard it was for me. She went on about how she'd been so lost after leaving, and how she'd realized too late that she'd made a mistake. But I wasn't buying it. I told her that leaving was a choice she made. She had planned it, lied about it, and then went through with it. Her regret didn't mean anything now. And that's when she snapped. Her whole tone changed. She dropped the sad, remorseful act and started going off on me, saying how I was being unfair, how I didn't have the decency to give her another chance. She actually had the guts to say, if I'd wanted to, I could have taken everything from you back then. I could have taken half of everything you own. I just stood there, amazed. This woman, who'd left me without a word, now thought she was entitled to some kind of reward for not trying to ruin me financially, like she deserved credit for not being as terrible as she could have been. I told her, so what? Am I supposed to be grateful? Grateful that you only ditched me and didn't take my stuff with you? She stared at me, her face a mix of anger and something else. Maybe desperation, maybe guilt. But honestly, by that point, I didn't care. I was just done. All those years I'd spent feeling guilty, questioning myself, wondering if I was somehow responsible for her leaving, they melted away right there. I finally saw her for who she was, and it felt like the weight I'd been carrying around was finally lifted. She wasn't done, though. She started pacing on my porch, ranting about how I'd never find anyone like her, and how I'd regret not giving her another chance. She actually tried to make me feel like I was the one who was missing out by not taking her back. It was bizarre. Here she was, the one who destroyed everything we had, acting like I should be begging her to stay. When she saw that I wasn't budging, she got even louder. going on about how I'd forced her to leave in the first place. She claimed that if I'd been more understanding about the whole kid thing, none of this would have happened. Apparently, according to her logic, my inability to give her a child meant I had failed her as a husband, which somehow justified her running off to have one with someone else. The mental gymnastics were impressive, honestly. I couldn't believe she was trying to pin her choices on me. I told her flat out, "Look, if you wanted a kid that badly, you could have told me the truth. You didn't have to lie to my face and pretend everything was fine while planning your exit." She had nothing to say to that, just stared at me like I'd slapped her. But I didn't let her get a word in. I went on, telling her, "You made that choice, all on your own, and now you've got to live with it. That's not my problem." She tried one last angle, switching back to her sad face, asking me to think about the child and how I was being unfair by turning my back on him. She had the kid in her arms, and she actually used him to guilt trip me like I was the bad guy here. But I wasn't falling for it. I told her, "I don't know that child. I have nothing to do with him. He's not mine, and neither are you." And that was it. I could see the realization finally sinking in for her. She knew I wasn't going to change my mind, that there was no way I'd let her back into my life. I could see the anger fading, replaced by something else, maybe actual regret, maybe just frustration. But it didn't matter to me. She was just a stranger now, a stranger who had tried to walk all over me and expected me to smile and thank her for it. She stood there for a few more seconds, like she was waiting for me to change my mind, to call her back. But I didn't say another word. I just stood there watching her face as it finally dawned on her that I meant every word. Then, without another look, I shut the door. And this time, I didn't wait for her to bang on it again. I knew deep down that I'd made my decision, and there was no going back. I walked away from the door, feeling, I don't know, like I'd finally won. She'd spent so much time thinking she could come back and manipulate her way into my life again, but it was over. I was free. There wasn't going to be a second chance, not for her, not for us. She was just a memory now, one I'd finally put in the past where it belonged. After all those years of guilt and pain, I finally felt like I could breathe again. And you know what? It felt good. The moment I closed that door on her, I felt this strange calm wash over me. I wasn't angry or sad or even shocked anymore. It was like every ounce of energy I'd spent on her for years, all the regret, the guilt, the endless wondering, it just vanished. I'd finally gotten the closure I didn't know I needed, and I was ready to move forward. It was over. For real, this time. But of course, things didn't end as cleanly as I'd hoped. A few days later, I got a text from her mom. She was apologizing, saying she was ashamed of how her daughter had handled everything and that she'd tried to talk some sense into her. But obviously, it hadn't worked. Her mom was a good person. She'd helped me out a lot after her daughter left, and I could tell she was genuinely upset about the whole thing. I didn't hold anything against her, but I wasn't interested in being roped back into that mess. I just replied with a polite, "Thanks for checking in," and left it at that. I wasn't going to give her mom any more details, and I wasn't going to waste time explaining my decision. She understood enough to know it was over. Over the next few weeks, I heard bits and pieces through mutual friends and social media. Apparently, she'd gone back to living with her parents, and it wasn't going smoothly. The guy she'd left me for, the kid's father, wasn't involved at all. He'd completely bailed. I guess he hadn't signed up for the long haul, and now she was stuck figuring it out on her own. She'd pretty much burned every bridge, so there weren't many people willing to lend a hand. Her old friends, the ones who were on my side when she first disappeared, had no sympathy for her. They'd all moved on and weren't too keen on getting dragged back into her drama. Can't blame them. Her parents weren't exactly thrilled either. They weren't in a great financial position to support her and a baby. I knew this because, not long after the text from her mom, I got a call from her dad. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the best of me. He was polite but direct, said they were struggling to make ends meet, and hinted that maybe I could help out a bit. He said, "We know you cared about her once," and kept going on about the baby and how hard things were for them. I listened politely, but when he started going on about how his daughter just needs a little support to get back on her feet, I couldn't help but laugh a little. Not out loud, but you get the point. I told him as nicely as I could that his daughter's choices were her own and that I wasn't in any position or mindset to help. I think he got the message because he didn't press further. The next thing I know, her friends start reaching out, people I hadn't heard from in years. A few tried the guilt angle, saying she was going through a rough time and that maybe I could find it in my heart to give her another chance. Another friend of hers even had the nerve to suggest that the kid needed a father figure and that I shouldn't let my bitterness get in the way of helping him out. But I stood my ground. I wasn't going to let anyone make me feel bad for finally choosing myself after years of feeling like I'd never be enough. I'd given that woman everything I had, and she'd thrown it away. The least she could do was own her choices instead of expecting me to bail her out. Over time, the calls and messages slowed down, and eventually, they stopped altogether. It was like everyone finally understood that I was serious, that I'd moved on and wasn't going to be roped back in. And that's when the real peace set in. My life felt quiet, normal, in a way it hadn't in years. I had my routines, my friends, my work. It wasn't a fancy, glamorous life, but it was mine, and I'd built it back up on my terms. The funny thing is, I started finding happiness in the little things again, stuff I hadn't really noticed when I was married. I'd go for walks, cook my own meals, read books I'd meant to get to for years. The freedom was refreshing, and I realized I didn't need anyone's permission to live the way I wanted. For once, I wasn't constantly worried about someone else's approval or happiness. It was like I'd gotten my life back, piece by piece. Every now and then, I'd run into someone who knew both of us, and they'd ask, "Hey, whatever happened with her?" I'd give a brief, polite answer and change the subject. It wasn't that I was hiding anything. I just didn't want to keep revisiting a chapter that was so clearly over. She was part of my past, and I'd finally learned how to leave her there. As for her, last I heard, things weren't going great. She was struggling to keep a job, still bouncing between her parents' place and friends' couches when she wore out her welcome. People I barely talked to anymore would message me occasionally, telling me she was asking for help from just about anyone who'd listen. Some of them even hinted that she was hoping I'd change my mind, that maybe I'd come around and decide to play dad to her kid after all. But that wasn't going to happen. I'd spent too much time and energy getting my life back to even think about going down that road. I wasn't going to be her safety net. Wasn't going to be the guy who picks up the pieces just because things didn't work out the way she planned. I was done with that chapter, and nothing was going to drag me back. In the end, I feel like I got the closure I needed. She'd made her choices, and now she was dealing with the consequences. And me? I finally felt free, truly, genuinely free, in a way I hadn't felt since the day she left. I was done letting her shadow hang over my life. I'd moved on, and I was content. Not happy in some big, dramatic way, but quietly, peacefully content. And you know what? That was enough.